All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the importance of private lands in borderland conservation. My name is Jen Cavexis, and I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the Salazar Center. Before we begin with today's program, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. And before we launch into speaking with our experts today, I have a few housekeeping things that I want to go over with all of you. We love hearing from our attendees with questions or comments or thoughts and concerns, but please use the chat for that submitting questions, not the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring the chat and passing those on to our speakers as we go. This session is being recorded, and we will share that recording with all of you after the event is done. Also, for those of you whose first language isn't English, we do have a Spanish translator with us today available in the Zoom room. To be able to access that, you should be able to see a button at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. It's just to the right of the Q&A button. You just have to click on that, and that'll bring you into the room where our interpreter, our awesome interpreter is, and will help you with language today. Today's webinar is part of several conversations that we've been having leading into our 4th International Symposium on Conservation Impact, during which we will focus on conservation across the US-Mexico border. It starts in just a few days. Thursday's when we get going with that. So there's still time to register. We'd love to see some of you there if you haven't already registered. If you're listening to this webinar today, you do get a discount on registration for the actual symposium. We'll put information about that in the chat. But today, I am so excited to have 2 phenomenal experts with us to discuss why private lands play such a pivotal role in conservation in the borderlands. First, we'll hear from Dr. Rodrigo Sierra Corona. He is currently the Director for Ecological Management at Santa Lucia Conservancy based in Southern California. He is a conservation scientist with over 15 years experience researching and implementing conservation practices on endangered landscapes and biodiversity. He completed his doctorate at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, working in the Chihuahuan Desert native grasslands. He took part in the designation of the Llanos Biosphere Reserve, protecting 1 million acres of grasslands and forests in northern Mexico. Rodrigo has worked on the recovery of black-footed ferrets, American bison, prairie dogs, and jaguars, and he's currently involved in trying to better understand the impacts of the US-Mexico border wall on wildlife. He'll be joined by Jeremiah Leibowitz, who's the Executive Director of Cuenca Los Ojos. Jeremiah is a Texas A&M graduate and a US Marine Corps veteran. He now oversees both the US and Mexico-based operations of CLO. His career began in water law, farm and ranch real estate law, and estate planning for agricultural families. Prior to joining CLO, he served as the land transaction director for the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. And prior to that, he served as the conservation director for the California Rangeland Trust, helping landowners protect their lands throughout California. And with that, Rodrigo, I'll pass it over to you to get started with your presentation.
All right. Good morning, everybody. So it's going to be very brief because we want to have enough time for questions and comments and get the conversation going. So when we discuss, and I want to talk about this, in this webinar, one of the things that it's always interesting to talk with colleagues is the idea of land tenure in Mexico, and even with like Mexican and non-Mexican colleagues, this idea that we do not have public lands in Mexico, and how that impacts our conservation efforts. So I'm going to talk very briefly about like land tenure and conservation in northern Mexico. Try to kind of shed a little bit of light of what kind of challenges we face and how conservation practice is dramatically different in Mexico than what you normally will think in the States. So this photo, it's inside the Llanos Biosphere Reserve, and if I mean, it's a protected area, and most of you would be kind of, okay, yeah, if it's a protected area, all that land is owned by one owner, and the objective is mostly like conservation of the environment. But just across this photo, there's at least five to seven different ownership on the land, and everything is being used for productive practices, right? So kind of like that puts you a little bit upside down on what you consider a conservation landscape. So let me go back to this thing. Okay, so when I started working in northern Mexico 20 years ago. I did my bachelor dissertation in 2002 in Cuenca, Los Ojos land, looking for black bears and mountain lions with three really good friends from our university in Querétaro. And then my first paid biologist job was working for the Northern Jaguar Project, which is another like prominent private conservation project in northern Mexico, looking for jaguars and how they move through the borderlands. Then I started working in Ojos. Before it was the Ojos Biosphere Reserve, and I was part of the team that put that legal instrument together. And there we work on bison recovery, prairie dogs, and eventually you realize that everywhere you are, it's somebody's land and it's under use. So that took me to get really into how we address land use and productive practices in order to improve conditions for wildlife. And then when you start doing that, you realize that, well, to improve conditions for wildlife, in a way, you need to improve conditions for the owners of the land. So it's like a very complex system. So I'm going to use the Ojos Biosphere Reserve as pretty much like as an example of what I'm talking about when I say private property. So the Ojos Biosphere Reserve pretty much is like at the corner of Chihuahua, Sonora, New Mexico, and Arizona, in the Mexican side, obviously. It goes from temperate forest at the top of the mountain ranges. This is the end of the thick-billed parrot distribution going north. So this is the northernmost nesting site for any parrot species in our continent. And going south, this is the edge of the distribution for bison, for prairie dogs. Going north, together with Cuenca, Los Ojos, Arizona areas, kind of like the northernmost areas for jaguars. So it's like this place where tropics meet the northern lands, and you have jaguars, golden eagles, and bald eagles in the same space, and black bears and Mexican wolves. So it's an incredibly rich place, but is not out of trouble. So during my PhD, one of the things that I was very intrigued was about the ecological history of the place, so how it has changed. So looking through archival material, we found these photos that are part of a dissertation of a student from UC Berkeley in 1936, Donald D. Brandt, and he did his research in Ojos, and he took this really nice landscape photo of what at the time was a super huge valley covered on perennial grasslands. And in the footnote, he mentioned that at the rate the land is being used and developed, and how ranching practices are implementing there, this place would be in severe problems pretty soon. So I came back almost 100 years after, and he was right. Like, most of the grassland have disappeared. It's turning into a scrubland, and it's mostly because overgrazing through time. So that's why kind of like the aim to protect the area. So in 2009, the Biosphere Preserve was decreed. And again, Biosphere Preserve in Mexico are a legal instrument that allows the federal government, in collaboration with the communities and with the owners through like a long process, to pretty much put a management plan on top of your private ownership and guide how practices happen. It's in a way very idealistic. It's very hard to implement. But in this map, what you can see is the map in your left. You're looking straight to the screen, so you can see where we're at in the corner, like in the top, in the bottom corner. That's right at that corner that I mentioned before. And this is kind of like the map, and this is like the zones on how you do different productive practices. And that is pretty straightforward. It's a management plan as any other place. But then in the right side, this is the ownership, kind of like who owns the land. And where these two arrows are pointing, those are the two kinds of public or federally owned property. And if you see it, we don't have any, right? So the red one is like federal zones, there's none. And the blue one is like national territories or public land as itself, and there's none, which means that the entirety of the preserve, of the Llanos Biosphere Preserve, it's owned by either communities, private ranchers. You go and buy a piece of land and it's yours. And we could say that 100% of the land is under some sort of use. Jeremiah is going to talk to you about Cuenca Los Ojos, which is located in the northwestern corner of the Biosphere Preserve. So then this leads us to kind of like the Mexico's land tenure problem or challenge, or just like, even you can see it not as a problem, but just like a particularity of where we're at. So we don't have public lands. According to some papers that I was reading, only 0.28% of the terrestrial surface is owned in some way by the federal government or state governments. So that 39.56% is private property as you understand it in the States. You go and buy a piece of land, and then 60% is communal property that it's being changing a lot. These were lands that were owned by ejidos or others, other organized communities, and it was a communal ownership. And since NAFTA in the 90s, this has transitioned a lot, and pretty much by today, most of these ejidos or communal owned land, it's either fully transitioned or it's transitioning towards private ownership. So at the end, we could say that almost 100% of the terrestrial surface in Mexico, it's privately owned. So in a way, what is the importance of private property in Mexico? Well, it's fundamental. So our conservation system is mostly based on biosphere reserves and other legal tools, but land ownership and use remains private. And in order to change environmental conditions, working with all the type of landowners is crucial. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it, and then we're going to go to questions and the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And we'll hold questions for now and just let Jeremiah give his talking points, and then we'll go into conversation.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you to the Salazar Center and for hosting this symposium and really shining a spotlight down on the southern border. It's a very special place, very diverse place, both from a people and animal standpoint. And so I'm excited to share the screen today with a colleague of mine, Rodrigo, and be able to share some thoughts about private land conservation in the borderlands. Yeah, as Rodrigo left off his presentation talking about the legal mechanisms and the importance of working with private landowners in Mexico to achieve the Mexico's conservation objectives. I'm going to share with you some background of our organization, the one that I'm a part of, called Cuenca Los Ojos, and use us as a case study of how a private piece of property ultimately became permanently protected, and kind of walk you through some of the mechanisms and do some comparing and contrasting between the US and Mexico as to how we did it. It's not the only way to do it, but I think it definitely, in working through this process, it definitely gave me the full scope of all the challenges and hurdles and obstacles that one can be faced with in trying to work on private land conservation in Mexico. So I like to believe that we are a success story, but time will tell. So with that, let me give you just a little bit of background on Cuenca Los Ojos. It started out as privately owned land almost 30 years ago when a lady by the name of Valaire Clark had an interest in conserving and restoring arid grasslands in northern Sonora, Mexico. That process and the landscape, the footprint that grew over time, was maintained in a private family foundation for almost 30 years, approaching 40, until the family realized that in order for that work to continue, there needed to be some sort of succession plan, because a private family foundation wasn't set up as the best mechanism to carry on the long-term restoration work for these lands. So in the process of coming up with a solution, a couple things happened. One, the family decided that there needed to be a public entity, a public charity entity in the United States to complement the one that existed in Mexico. So the organization that I oversee has two sister organizations, a 501c3 in the US, as well as its equivalent in Mexico. A civil association is how they're referred to in Mexico. So that was step one, is set up these organizations that are going to be responsible for the long-term land management. The second piece was, okay, well, we have this land ownership issue. And for those on today's webinar who may not be familiar with land ownership in Mexico, something to keep in mind is foreign peoples, entities, individuals are not allowed to own land in Mexico in their personal name, personally owned land, within what's called an exclusion zone, which is about 100 kilometers south of the international border. Well, our preserve and these lands that we manage are right on the border, so they're obviously within that exclusion zone. So how did it work? Without going into too great a detail, the bottom line is that there's a way to own land in Mexico in these excluded areas through a Mexican corporation, which is what happened. But ultimately, these lands were transferred into essentially a trust. Okay, so for those familiar with land conservation in the United States, we have a legal mechanism, a real estate tool called a conservation easement, which allows a landowner to put a blanket protection over their land that will run with the land in perpetuity. And depending on the type of conservation easement, various restrictions can be put on it, and certain uses authorized and certain uses prohibited. That same mechanism does not exist in Mexico. The alternative, at least the option that our organization chose, was to have these lands conveyed into a trust, okay? And then in that trust document, part of it incorporated the standard, I'll call them standard, but they were tailored to this project, but the language that you would normally see in a conservation easement. So we embedded those terms and those conditions into this trust document to serve as a guide for how the organization was going to be tasked with managing these lands long term. So we conveyed all these lands into a trust, but then there's also the component of, well, great, the lands are protected legally, but how are you going to pay for the management? How are you going to pay for the restoration? How are you going to pay to ensure that you have staff available to manage the land? In our particular model, we were fortunate enough to pair with a private foundation, an international foundation, that essentially provided an operating endowment that the earnings of which go to help fund the long-term operational needs of this land management project. Now, these resources, they don't pay for restoration, they don't pay for new projects, they're just our baseline. They keep us on life support. And then, as any other nonprofit, we are out there writing grants, raising money to do all the other work that we're required to do and that we have a management plan for. So again, in our model, this idea of conveying these private lands out of a family foundation into a trust vehicle that then appointed our nonprofit to be the long-term land manager. And then also we had a financial mechanism attached to the project that made it viable in the long term. So a lot of moving parts and a lot of moving pieces to how our project came together. But I do believe, given the size of our footprint in northern Sonora, Mexico, the preserve is currently 121,000 acres. And so when we look at the private land holdings in Mexico, as Rodrigo discussed, there's hardly any, we'll call it negligible, just no public lands. However, the private land holdings in Mexico are substantial. And the private landowners are actually interested in conservation. The challenge is they've also got to make a livelihood out of their land holdings, but they also want to do right by the animals, by the water, by the environment, by the grasses, etc. So we are working and trying to figure out ways that this model that we've adopted, how can we make that applicable to other folks, and recognizing that it may not be the only way to do it. It's just one of many, but at the end of the day, the critical piece here, and Rodrigo touched on it as well, is that conversation has to happen with the private landowner. And as long as you can work with them, start addressing their concerns and their needs as to how these things will legally work in Mexico, my experience has been is that you actually get quite a few partners, a number of landowners who are interested in taking that next step and figuring out how to conserve and protect their private property. So, Jen, with that, I will turn it back over to you for follow-on questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, both Jeremiah and Rodrigo. So as we were pulling together the symposium and its themes this year, I was really struck as we were chatting with partners and colleagues in the borderlands, and in particular who work in Mexico, about this consistent notion or this consistent idea of the importance that the centering conservation in this area around people and making sure that conservation could still balance the sustainable livelihood working lands aspect of this. And, you know, given what we just heard from both of you, I'm wondering if you could both maybe dive in a little bit more how, you know, you incorporate in those conversations with private landowners how they're going to sustain the working part of their lands, and how do you balance that with some of your, you know, the larger conservation goals that you're trying to meet.
Rodrigo, you want to go first?
I can. So, well, that is a very, I mean, depending the owner, right? It could be from a very straightforward conversation where you can find common ground, and we had work and solidify some amazing partnerships through time from small ejido communities or small ejido landowners, because again, you're dealing with communities that own land together, and organizing and working with humans is, I mean, if this was only land management questions, I think our work will be way easier, right? And with some private owners, it's the same, kind of like we have some amazing partnerships, and we have developed friendships with cattle ranchers that are wondering how what they do can be better and how they can make this place better for their kids and their kids' kids. And so there's owners where common ground is humongous, and the conversation goes pretty easily. But then there's others where, I mean, we have neighbors like that everywhere. I mean, like we just drove from Carmel to Phoenix yesterday, and you pass through some segments in Highway 5 that is kind of like, oh my God, this place is just like destroyed, right? It's kind of like you have owners that will extract every penny that they can from a landscape. And sometimes the conversations are harder to get there, kind of like bringing sustainability into a model that is just not accounting for. So the interactions here are very personal. I mean, you start sometimes in meetings, but then you go to drink coffee and talk about life and talk about objectives and figure out if you can find that common ground. So it's a lot of work on kind of like building relationships and again finding those common points. And obviously that sounds, oh, that's very nice, but it's super slow, right? Like this is not change that happens in a year, right? Like you build and you build and you build. And if the ownership changes, because that's the challenge of private ownership, like this idea of foreverness that you have in a national park. I mean, I think no one questions if Yellowstone is going to be there in 10 years. In Mexico, sometimes you question if the owners sell the land and the buyer is into agriculture or into renewable energy, the place will go. So there's a lot of challenges there, but there's a lot of ways to talk about and work with the partners.
And I'll follow up and share that from our perspective with Cuenca Los Ojos, one thing we take a look at is, thankfully, as an organization, we have the ability to provide jobs. We're an employer in Mexico. That's a big, providing a good paying job in conservation is a big deal, and it's not very common. So working with landowners and other partners who are interested in this model, by explaining to them that they're going to help continue this type of livelihood for others. They're going to be able to stay in business, but also be able to provide potential employment for people in their community who can then stay on the land and who can stay locally and don't have to travel very far. The other thing that we share, Jen, in these conversations is trying to help these landowners understand other options and opportunities that are available to them to generate income. So again, they're very interested in conservation, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is that they do have to make a living. So we've started a big conversation surrounded around ecosystem services, and specifically carbon credits and the potential that those might have for landowners in Mexico to generate residual income over time, helping them expand potential agricultural markets for some of their products. Again, we are a research organization, we're a land manager organization, we're not in business to make money, but that does give us a platform to experiment and look at other options that then, if it works for us, we can maybe take it over the fence line, if you will, and share it with our neighbors to see if it's something, some sort of practice that they're interested in adopting. And then the other thing I've realized in the short time I've been working with this organization is the general philanthropic environment in Mexico is extremely different. It's almost a 180 from what people are familiar with in the United States. And what people in Mexico and landowners in Mexico don't realize is the availability of grant funding and philanthropic funding that we're very accustomed to here in the United States. Again, being a nonprofit on both sides of the border, we have access to those types of resources. But when we can share with our neighbors, both private landowners, ejidos, and others, and incorporate them into projects that we're doing, it's really an education piece to help them understand that there are other resources out here. You're not going to have to continue just to scratch a living out of your land. Other people want to help you achieve your objectives and your goals for your land. So exploring all that comes together with land ownership, I wouldn't say taking the American model into Mexico, but where it's applicable, providing those tools and resources to our landowner partners in Mexico, and then getting them on board so that they as well can access those things.
Yeah, that's understanding the full breadth of the tools and that slow process of the relationship building when you're doing this on a neighbor to neighbor kind of basis is a huge challenge. And kudos to both of you for putting in the investments for building those relationships. I wanted to circle back on something that, Rodrigo, you had touched on just as you were finishing your remarks, which was this notion of the long term. So, typically when we think about public lands conservation in the US or Canada, we put places like Yellowstone or Rocky Mountain National Park into some kind of protection, and we have some sense of confidence that it will remain protected for a very, very long time. When we think about relying so heavily on private land conservation, how do we achieve the same sort of longevity of protection for conservation outcomes and sort of sustainable livelihoods? What sort of paths have you all explored in your different experiences?
I think that is one of the hardest questions to answer, kind of like from the Mexican experience. Mm-hmm. And I mean, and that ties to this question that, let me remember who put it there, that Suzanne put, right? Kind of like, if there's no government-owned lands, but they're protected, kind of like who actually protect the land if they're still private? Well, it's private property. So for me or for everybody else to enter your private property, you need to give me permission. So unless I have like a legal case against you and I have granted authority to go past your gate, if you don't open the door or you don't open your branch gate, I cannot get in, mm-hmm. right? So you still, while you have this protection or legal documents on top of it, your front gate is your front gate. And she asked about like enforcement. Well, it's the same kind of like, or enforcement, how you say, like institution is not precisely well suited for the job. So there's a huge, there are huge holes still. So there's some instruments that you can add to your land as a private owner, and we have some good friends that are productive ranchers that decide to get into a legal instrument called the voluntary protected areas that are recognized by the federal government. You actually ask to be a protected area, and you submit kind of like your management plan and what you're seeing there, and the federal government gives you kind of like the same kind of protection level that any other biosphere reserve. So you can add that to kind of like how your land is protected in the long term. But even that one has like a timeline, right? I think it's 15 years, if I'm not wrong, or 25 years. You can renew it, you can change it. But again, the reality is that unless you put together something kind of like that strong as what Cuenca did, or what other institutions in Mexico are doing to ensure the protection of the place in the long run, again, it's up to the owner to decide how far they want to go, right? Kind of like we don't have, I feel like we still don't have that kind of way to lock the land. I mean, even the management plans for the biosphere preserve, I mean, they should be building consensus with communities and private ranchers. That is terribly difficult, tend to not go that well. So there's still a lot of challenges in how to achieve land conservation, land management, and the in forever part of it, which is probably in a way that's our model, so you understand it. But when you talk with colleagues, and it's kind of like, yeah, just imagine if you were kind of like, well, I hope Yellowstone stays there for 5 more years, because it comes out that the owner of Yellowstone is selling. So I mean, and that tends to be kind of like a crisis, right? Like sometimes you have like these favorite places that the rancher is amazing, then they put the ranch for sale, and you're like, oh my God, who's going to buy it? I hope they're not going to change it. So that is a huge question mark.
Mm-hmm. And Jeremiah, I mean, you know, the model that CLO has evolved, or I guess maybe perfected over time, how transferable or scalable do you think that is, given conditions in Mexico, to achieve that sort of longer term protection piece?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jenny. And I think, you know, the trick is, you know, recruiting the right landowner. I mean, there are landowners who have had family land in their, you know, for generations in Mexico, but that long-term conservation and long-term protection was at odds with the ability for them to make a living on the land. You know, the two were in conflict. Whereas in the United States, we're starting to see that, hey, you can protect land, you can put a conservation easement on, you know, we have other tools that we can use and still enhance the ability of that private landowner to make a living. Mm-hmm. In Mexico, when we put this land into the trust vehicle, it's not in perpetuity as a conservation easement would be in the States. It's for a 50-year, that's 50, a 50-year renewable term. It was the next best thing that we could come up with, recognizing that as a nonprofit, both in the U.S. and Mexico, the likelihood of us renewing that is very, very high, because the alternative of this project failing, you know, there's a lot of other dominoes that would fall as a result. So I would tell you that our project in putting this land in a trust is still new, especially new for the private landowning community that we are engaged with in Sonora and now expanding into Chihuahua. So they're waiting to look, and they're waiting to see how this is going to play out. And all we can do is continue to live up to the terms of the trust, continue to manage our lands in the manner that we, you know, that is prescribed for our management plans. And at any time there's an interest by these landowners in exploring what options are available to them, we want to be that resource. And that's kind of the niche that we're carving out for ourselves is, hey, we tried this, seems to be working so far. If you're interested, you know, we're happy to try and get you on the path. And that's where we are.
Excellent. So we have a question from the audience. It's, I think, a clarifying question. around this idea of communally owned land and the term ejidos. That's definitely not, we don't have something like that in the US. So maybe we can start with you, Rodrigo, and just explain a little bit more details about what that means.
Yeah, and I will try to be brief. So every time you drop the ejido topic, I mean, we can spend hours talking about what it is and what were the motivations and all that. So if you want to kind of like, Susan, if you want to send me an email, we can take this offline if you need more clarification. Because again, we can talk for hours about this thing. So
you have 30 seconds, Rodrigo.
exactly. So ejidos as a baseline is kind of like after the Mexican Revolution, kind of the main motive of the Mexican Revolution to happen, well, one of many, was land consolidation, right? Like at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, most of Mexican land, in a way, it's coming back to that land consolidation, was pretty much on private hands. And at the time, we used to have federal lands. But most indigenous communities and rural communities pretty much got their land taken away from, got privatized, and pretty much people were excluded from the land. You can work for people or something. So one of the main purposes of the Mexican Revolution was give land back to the communities that used to own them. So that happened after the Mexican Revolution. That happened for some time. And during President, oh my God, Lázaro Cárdenas, land giveaway was set to be finished in 1936, I think. Probably I'm giving some dates wrong, but this is kind of the timeline that this happened. So at the end, we have most of indigenous populations getting some of their land back, and ranchers keep the land. Federal government still hold a lot of public lands. And then during the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of social unrest in Mexico, and pretty much the federal government used the remaining federal land as a pressure valve to alleviate social pressure. So start giving land away to people that were demanding land for livelihoods, and cutting deals with other big ranchers. So it was it was a very complicated, there's books about this. And so then what you have today, for example, like in Northern Mexico, most communities, you have all the ejidos. Like in Janos, you have some very old ejidos that go back from being either Janos, Sumas, or even Apache communities back in the day, that they got their land recognized. But then most of the ejidos in Janos and Northern Sonora, I think as well, are mostly from the 80s, like very late 80s. And most of those communities are, what I understand, I mean, I was like a newborn in the 80s. So what happened is that there was like this system where you put your name, kind of like, I want land, and I'm demanding this land, and I'm part of this group. And then eventually the federal government pretty much like raffled your name, and you could live in Central Mexico, and then you got land in Chiapas or in Chihuahua, and there you go. And some of my friends in Janos are coming. They came from mining families in Zacatecas, and they got land in Chihuahua, where the thing that they can do is ranching. So then you pretty much put like all these you make these artificial communities, shake them up and throw them in some place. And then that's where the ejido starts. So you have like a set amount of land for this community. And there used to be rules of like, you cannot sell, you cannot transfer, it can only transfer to the family. And then after NAFTA in 1992, 1994, the way the rules work got changed. And pretty much now you can just sell your properties. Kind of like, well, the land was for 100 and it was like 100 acres. So it's 1 acre for each of us. You square the thing, you get your fee, and now you can sell it. So again, it's a super dynamic process. There's a lot of gray in what I just described. And if you think that I'm wrong, probably you're right. Because again, there's like so many ways to see the ejido topic in Mexico. It's fascinating, but at the same time, it's extremely challenging.
Yeah, actually, that ties in to a few of the comments or questions that are coming in the Q&A in the chat, which is just this idea of like how challenging it must be like what are the challenges in working with individual private landowners to sort of aggregate land to get into these conservation practices? And I would imagine that Ojos looks very different or adds a layer of complexity to that. But maybe, if both of you could just speak a little bit to like the actual process of how you reach out to the private landowners and some of the challenges that you faced in that. And then also just thinking again about that neighbor to neighbor piece. We're talking about lands that are sitting just on the Mexico side of the American US-Mexico border, but how does that conversation look like with any neighbors that might be on the US side of the border? Do you, like at Jeremiah, specifically for you, as part of CLO's management, do you have sort of conversations with folks on the US side of the border?
Yeah, really good question, and definitely a component, at least for the preserve that we manage. Yes, the fence is merely a material barrier. It's a physical barrier, but the reality is the landscapes that we manage to the south and with our neighbors to the north are part of the same system. And so, one of our neighbors to the north is the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge. Many people on this call may not realize that there's a wildlife refuge, a very small one, but it's there in southern Arizona, and it's on our northern border. So we've got a really very close working relationship with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because we're managing the same watershed. We're managing the San Bernardino Cienega, and constantly working cross-border to ensure that the objectives that the refuge is trying to attain, that our practices aren't impeding that, and vice versa. But then you also have just private landowners, private ranchers that have some very large land holdings north of the border, who we have to coordinate with. Fires can start on the southern end of the border, right south of the wall, and guess what? They can blow and they can start burning stuff in the north. Well, we've got to coordinate those efforts, and we've got to be on the lookout. Just because we have an international boundary, I would represent to everyone on this call that it's literally like your next door neighbor. From a land management and relationship standpoint, we work closely with all of our neighbors on the border. Sometimes, later on in the symposium, but I'll mention it now. Simply, we've got gates, water gates that are open in the wall to allow water to pass during the washes. Excuse me, the big monsoon rains. Well, there's cattle grazing on both sides of the wall. And so, we're all looking out for each other's cattle, making sure that animals, if they cross, they get back. So it's a 30-foot metal wall, but at the same time, the relationships are still grounded in what people would expect, comes from working with your ranching and landowner neighbors.
Rodrigo, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so my experience was more like, so when I started working in Ojos, pretty much I was a field tech for lab at the National University. So our way to interact with our neighbors was mostly kind of like, we're counting prairie dogs. We're kind of like Jehovah's Witnesses, kind of like, we're counting prairie dogs. Could I enter your place and count your prairie dogs? Mm-hmm. And obviously that leads to a lot of very funny conversations, kind of like, why you care about prairie dogs? Kind of like, why you're coming all the way from central Mexico to count prairie dogs? Are they that important? And sometimes that opens conversations, right? And in a way that kind of like interactions went again from ejidos to big ranches, like most of the time was like try to find something that we thought was there, like bison, pronghorn, jaguars, prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets, porcupines. And then you want to explore the land, you ask for permission, and then you start getting kind of like this communication. And then we start getting very active. Gerardo Ceballos, my advisor, Eduardo Ponce, and myself, like 10 years ago or something, we're discussing kind of like, well, we should go from counting prairie dogs to start doing something about the land that these animals live in. And we start bringing instructors to the research station in Ojos and talking about how you can improve land management, right? Because again, in a lot of ways, as a conservationist in Mexico, you got trained to this idea of like, you protect the land, you take people out of the land, and then the land is protected. But then in Mexico, that pretty much cannot happen, or at least we don't have the instruments to do that. So people needs to be in, what Jeremiah just says, kind of like they need to make a living, and you need to find ways to improve conditions while you still have all the other needs in place. So with these workshops, we start pretty much like meeting with all the neighbors, talking about something that it's actually interesting for them. It's kind of like, well, prairie dogs are great, but so if I do all this, what, like, and it's part of the comments too, it's kind of like what it's for me. Some of them are kind of like, no, I will protect them because it's the right thing to do. But others are, well, if I increase productivity while doing this at the same time, then it's a no-brainer. So Jose Manuel Perez, who is part of Cuenca Los Ojos, he's our conservation director and operations manager in Mexico. And we, for example, like we are founding members of Manejo Regenerativo de Ranchos, which is like a big group of producers that kind of navigate towards regenerative ranching, right? And how improving conditions in the land at the end improves conditions for production. So this group has been terribly successful. I'm fairly disconnected because now I'm kind of like managing most of my stuff in California, but kind of like their relationships with ranchers and with ejidos have been kind of like from very personal ties to creating even institutions that conglomerate private owners and help find solutions, sometimes through how to improve grazing, how to increase your productivity, bringing workshops. So it's kind of like that human aspect that most of the time in the conservation world goes kind of like unchecked most of the time.
Yeah, that is fascinating, the challenge, the different sort of levels of challenges that you have to face in trying to build all of these relationships. But it also brings to mind sort of another aspect of trying to balance these issues between sustainable livelihoods and wildlife conservation. So Rodrigo, you mentioned about, you know, various wildlife that are part of the conservation goals or that are being monitored and researched. I'm just curious, you know, here in the US, we often have a lot of conflicts between ranchers who are trying to raise cattle and concerns, perceived or real, about having particularly sort of larger carnivores being returned to the land. And I'm wondering, is that part of the conversations that you need to have with the landowners, whether ejidos or larger individual ranchers or these larger conglomerates of ranchers that you work with?
Ooh, yes, this is another topic that we can spend days. So yes, kind of like the conflicts are similar, but I feel like that's where you can tell that the cultures are different too. So like there was not long ago that there was this paper about jaguar conservation in the borderlands, and they were really pushing to kind of like, well, you need to bring jaguars into the US. And some of the comments were kind of like, well, yeah, they're being obliterated in Mexico and we need to give them like a safe space to be in. And at the same time, I was kind of like, yes, but I was getting kind of like this funny feeling. Because I was like, well, jaguars are crossing the border kind of like from Mexico up, kind of like our populations are fairly stable, if you want to say that. The animals are looking for ranges. So we have conflicts, but I think sometimes the resolution is different, right? So kind of like if you think about these big predators, like jaguars got wiped out from the US, they are in Cuenca up to the border wall, right? Kind of like they're here. Mm-hmm. Mexican wolves, they got wiped out in the US. The recovery program starts by sending someone to pick the last Mexican wolves in Mexico. And the reintroduction has been super rocky and bumpy and a lot of challenges, but Mexican wolves are moving through the mountain ranges, through ranches, and there's conflict, but I feel like while there's, again, culturally is different. It's not better or worse. I think it's just like how we deal with those conversations is different. Prairie dogs is another great example. Pretty much like they got wiped out for the entire distribution. And by the 90s, the biggest colonies were in northern Mexico. And ranchers still hate them, but they're there, right? So I feel like there's this, like Jeremiah said something very interesting, kind of like, we don't want to export the US model. And in a way, we have learned that just exporting a model across the border doesn't work. Kind of like we really need to make or suit kind of like custom tailored. And that is sometimes sometimes creativity gets stuck in bureaucracy and copying models. But again, I feel like there's, and I think there's people in the panel, I mean, in the attendees that have worked with endangered species in northern Mexico, and they will tell you, I mean, like bison, before the border wall, there was a bison herd that used to cross between Mexico and the US. And in Mexico, I think no one was complaining in the way that ranchers in Yellowstone complain if the bison leave Yellowstone, right? So it's kind of like we have different approaches to nature, even that we are so close together.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think I don't have any solid answer. But that is
That was a fairly solid answer. Jeremiah, how about you, with your experiences at CLO, how do you manage, has that issue of, spillover of the wildlife that you're trying to preserve, is that part of the management plan for CLO, and how do you navigate those conversations with your neighbors?
No, it definitely is part of our management mission. We're here to restore the wildlife. We're here to restore the habitat, and part and parcel of that is that we're going to have, if we're successful, then yes, we're going to have apex predators back on the landscape, and as part of that integration, we all understand, there are times, where I'll visit with Jose Manuel, whose name was mentioned earlier, and there has been some predation, right? We maybe a calf was eaten or a bear attacked, one of the younger animals, and we have the luxury on our preserve of looking at that and understanding, well, that's kind of the tax that's going to need to be paid for the work that we're doing on trying to restore wildlife and habitat and species back to this landscape. Well, that same perspective may not always resonate well with our neighbors who are actually trying to, raise a herd to sell. So what do we do? Well, it goes back to the relationships. And, if we are experiencing those types of activities on our preserve, the likelihood is that our neighbor is also experiencing those. And so we're working with them. We're part of research projects in some instances where these animals can be tracked. And so talking to them about it, trying to understand their concerns, trying to figure out, are there some adjustments to the management landscape that could mitigate some of those damages? As an example, in the United States, there are some scenarios whereby producers come together, and in the event that they lose animals due to predation, there's somewhat of a pool of resources, of money available that can be shared with these producers to offset the loss of those animals. I use that as an example. We don't have that necessarily in Mexico around the lands that we work on, but is that an option, right? So just having those conversations with landowners, talking through what are the solutions they need in order to allow wildlife to stay on the landscape while also making a living. So yeah, it's a daily conversation that we're engaged with.
So just to complement that last one, so I started a small ejido sustainable grazing cooperative like 11 years ago, and we're kind of like working with these guys, and instead of me being kind of like, my idea was like, I want to stop being the biologist that show up and tell you what to do without understanding anything about what I'm asking you to do. So I asked them if I could join them and start my own cattle program with them. So we leased land together. I bought some cows, and I was like, I want to understand ranching because I want to be able to kind of like really be there, right? So I bought cows. This is 2012 and 2015. If there's ranchers in the call, you remember how good that year was for the prices. It was crazy good, right? I think it was the only year that I truly made money on my cows. So one of the rules was like, if we are going to get together and we're leasing land from the Nature Conservancy at the time, there's no predation, there's no predator control. If we get something eaten by coyotes or whatever, Mexico has an insurance for cattle predation. It is not like super straightforward, but you get something, right? I mean, and so it's kind of like there's this thing, and everybody's kind of like, but not even shooting coyotes. I was like, no, we're not shooting anything. Kind of like if it dies, it's like it's a tax. We pay a lot of taxes. We can afford this one. Who gets the first calf eaten? Me, right? And then it's kind of like after the experience, you see the coyote is like, I still like you, but you just cost me $900, dude. right? So kind of like being in their shoes and understanding that at the end, conflict happens because, I mean, in my head, that calf was already for something, right? It was like, oh, I need to do this. That calf is going to provide those $800. Well, those $800 are gone. So just for myself as a biologist and conservationist, channeling that like anger toward the coyote, because I could see the coyote every day there. Like, okay, you're good, dude. Just don't keep doing what you're doing. So yeah, it's very nice.
That's very admirable that you took on the additional challenge of trying to, like, literally walking in the shoes of the people that you're working with, by trying to actually take on some ranching yourself. Well, we only have a few minutes left here. I wanted to, before I close off, wanted to give both of you a chance to just talk a little bit about, what keeps you going. What are some of the success stories that helps you get out of bed each day, and what you would want people to know who are from outside of the borderlands, that they could take away a lesson learned from the work that you all have been doing in the borderlands. Jeremiah, I'll start with you.
Okay, yeah, it's a very broad question, Jim, but I think one of the reasons I came to this position, working with this organization and working in Mexico, I try and explain to family members all the time. They're asking, what exactly do you do? And I've been in land conservation probably coming up on about 15 years in my career. And my goal has always been to be part of projects where we can conserve and protect, really, really large landscapes. And the truth of the matter, in my experience, is that those landscapes in the United States are very hard to come by. Thankfully, we do have public lands and we have state and federal, we do have some landscapes in the states that are protected. But from the private landowner standpoint, private landowners in the states tend to have some very good land, and land that would be great to protect if it was at all possible. But what I've observed in Mexico is that those landscapes still exist. These really large intact landscapes that are extremely wild, extremely beautiful, and really have landowners that if the mechanisms were there, if the financial situations were in place, I really don't believe that conserving the lands would be a hard next step for them to take. And so, we've been very fortunate in doing this project. I mentioned we had some international foundation provide the large chunk of our operating endowment, but we also worked really, really closely with another conservation finance NGO in Mexico that's got a sterling reputation, Fondo Mexicano, and their objective in Mexico is really to help develop and bring to bear the financial resources that I would argue are more prevalent in the U.S., but to help get them on the ground in Mexico, to help get them, get those conservation dollars on the ground, and maybe working with folks like us, CLO, as an example of the possibilities, right? I definitely would say we're probably an outlier in this conservation space, but over time, and people get to observe what we do, and working with the partners that we do, that people will begin to understand that conserving land in Mexico is a possibility. And so the last thing I'd want to say to all those attending today is simply, there's a lot going on these borderlands from California to Texas, not just in the US, but also in Mexico. And I'm really grateful that the symposium is shining a spotlight on the southern border this year, because, if you're familiar with Mexico on the call, great. But if you're not, I highly encourage you to try and find some time to get down there. From a conservation standpoint, from a human standpoint, the people, the animals, the wildlife, the water, it's a special place, and it's worth putting a lot of attention towards conserving and protecting. And I'm just really grateful that I've got that opportunity to work with, I was going to say work with great people like Rodrigo, but he's on the fringe. But no, there's a lot of, I was looking at the participation list of those attending the webinar, and a lot of those folks I've worked with and are colleagues, and all trying to row the boat, the conservation boat in Mexico, as hard and as fast as we can. And I'm just grateful to be part of the team.
Thank you for that. Rodrigo, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I mean, the landscape, as Jeremiah said, the landscape is amazing. I'm a true believer that change can happen, right? I mean, probably after what I've been saying, you're kind of like, oh my God, this is like how you're going to fix this. When I'm obsessed with fixing problems, kind of like that is like my true obsession. If there's something that I think we can help and I think I can be part of it, that's what keeps me going. And I feel like this is it's a planetary challenge. It's not that it's only for us. Kind of like we are all in this hole together, and we need to find our way out. And there's always like through this kind of like pretty much like through all my career, which is not that long, even like either Mexico or in my current position in California, I have seen that we can change things, right? Kind of like I feel like for me, that is like the key thing that keeps me going is that I have seen change. Sometimes not in the direction that you wanted, but sometimes and sometimes in a super amazing ways, I have seen improvements. And sometimes those improvements came from people trying to do the right thing. So again, I always tell my friends kind of like everything you hear about the borderlands, it's true, right? But there's a lot of things that you don't hear about that are amazing. So I feel like that's kind of like my key things. Kind of like, I'm aching to crossing the border. Like I will be crossing the border this evening to go to Cuenca and then to Ojos to visit friends and stuff. So it's just like culturally, it's an incredible place. Biodiversity speaking, it's an incredible place. It's a huge challenge. If you want to keep yourself busy, join us. There's a lot of work to do. But again, kind of like places like Cuenca, Los Ojos, and all the restoration that they have done through the years, that keeps you going. It's kind of like, you can see change, right? I've been witnessing Cuenca for the last 20 years, and it's one of the few places in Mexico where you go back and it's better than the year previous. And some ranches and communities owned by good friends in Ojos, you go there and it's better than what it was before. So positive change can happen, and I like to think that I'm part of it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you both for being with us today and sharing your learnings and your wisdom and knowledge about conservation in northern Mexico and the borderlands. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I do hope you will join us at the symposium, whether in person or virtually, where we will continue this conversation. We have additional other experts talking about all sorts of aspects of conservation in the borderlands and across Mexico and the US. So please do join us if you can. We'd love to see you there. Thank you, everyone. Bye.